I was born and raised in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I come from that part of the state, represented not just that area, but Southside Virginia in Congress, and have lived in Alexandria the last 6 years. So kind of experienced the north to south bridge of a very diverse state. In fact, the 5th District, which was the size of New Jersey, we sometimes joked was really a mid-Atlantic state on top of a Bible Belt state on top of a Rust Belt state, because we went from the Charlottesville area into Lynchburg and Jerry Falwell's University, and then down into the area that used to be the manufacturing and tobacco hub of the state, but at the time I represented it, had 24% unemployment. Very hard hit after the globalization period and then the Great Recession. And I say that, I'll come back to this in a bit, but I think having represented some of the redder parts of the state is both something that gives me some concerns right now, but also some seeds of hope, which I'll talk about. So for me, I grew up in a faith tradition that was very focused on service, based on Bishop Sullivan's work. We basically heard on the weekends, if you weren't doing something for the poor and vulnerable, then you were going to be going to a very bad place someday. So I started out doing service work out of a sense of guilt, but I stayed because of the joy. And so all I've done for 20 years really is nonprofit work. I've started about 6 nonprofit organizations related to poverty eradication, looking at climate change issues, looking at racial reconciliation and justice issues. And in the process of that, which was mainly based here, ended up getting pulled into some work overseas. So I would go back and forth between issues of inequality and vulnerable communities here in the U.S., and then I would go overseas and ended up working in West Africa and Sierra Leone for 2 years, helping with the peace negotiations to end a 10-year civil war there. And I'm going to tell you that story because it relates a little bit to today. When I was finishing up helping to create this human rights clinic in West Africa, the life expectancy there at the time was 36 years old. Hundreds of thousands had been killed. And this woman who had encouraged me to come over and start this project sat me down under a tree and she said, "Tom, you need to move here. In the next 12 months, we have a chance to end this war. We can disarm all these child soldiers who've been recruited and drugged and sent into battle. We can get a peace deal. We can get a truth commission and actually hold some of these terrible people accountable for the things that they had done." I said, "That all sounds great, Zainab, but what can I do? I don't know the country. I don't know the language. I don't know really anything about the place. How can I be helpful?" And she said, "Well, it would be really helpful because if you were standing next to me, I'd be less likely to get shot." And I thought that was the best job pitch I had ever been given. So I tore up my signing bonus and decided to move to West Africa. And sure enough, within 6 months, these courageous women who had been trying for years to break this stranglehold, this paralysis in the peace process, were able to break through and get a peace deal in a country everyone had given up on, but has never gone back to war in the 10 years since then. And what I figured out in that process for me was, I don't need to have the answers. I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. I just need to figure out who is, and then use the structural privileges that I have to be able to amplify voices that don't always get heard. So all of my work since then has really been about trying to be a partner to people on the front lines of struggles for a more just and fair society. When I moved back, I ended up running for Congress, which was a crazy idea because, well, first of all, anyone entering politics is crazy. But in particular, no Democrat had come within 20 points of winning the 5th District since they gerrymandered the map. And I was 36% behind in the race. But I had a crazy idea, which was that we could connect with people based on values. And those values were fairness and justice. And that our assumptions about some of these red counties might be wrong. That there's actually an enormous reservoir of compassion and care. And that often the legislators that we see, we assume represent those areas. But so often, and I'm finding that on the campaign right now as well, they're actually representing huge ideological donors like the Koch brothers who've told them they have to have a 100% rating, not actually representing people in their communities who care deeply about their neighbors and care deeply about suffering. So we were able to come from 36 points behind and win that race. And that put me in a position, getting elected with Barack Obama, to go up and actually do some things. So the party and some in D.C. said to me, "Well, that was kind of crazy that you ran that way, but now we'll tell you how to do it. distance yourself from the president, vote against some crucial things, etc., and you'll be fine. But that's not really what I went there to do. So I voted for the Stimulus Act to try to prevent a depression. And then when the healthcare debate came up, even though it was extremely contentious in my district, I voted for the Affordable Care Act. In fact, I'm even more proud of voting for the first version of the ACA that left the House, that still had a public option in it, that still had caps on spending increases, and included negotiation of cheaper prescription drug rates. And my view generally is when we stand stronger for a fair system, we still get the same people against us, but we give a lot of other folks more of a reason to care and be part of these efforts. The ACA, of course, was a step forward. It was not a solution to everything. Certainly it was something that eliminated the issue of pre-existing conditions that I know for many families who have a member with autism and other issues can be an enormous factor. The fact that people could stay on health care until 26 years old has been a lifeline for many families, economically and otherwise. And of course, the Medicaid expansion piece was never really meant to be severable and negotiable. It was part of what made the whole system work. Many states figured that out. Some, like Virginia, unfortunately, have continued to come out against that year after year after year. And I'll say another word about that shortly. Anyway, after the people of the 5th District were wise enough to kick me out of Congress and send me back, I didn't go and take a lobbying job. I went and ran a nonprofit organization working on inequality and fairness and justice issues and trying to work on the implementation of the ACA. And then President Obama asked me to come in. I did 2 jobs for him. The first was the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. I'm sure you all read it. It's a real page turner. But I'd started a number of organizations, one of which is the largest advocacy group in the world, and he asked me to do a strategic review of the State Department and USAID. So I was looking at a $50 billion budget, 80,000 employee shop with installations around the world, saying both how do we look at the policy side, which was issues like making climate change one of the core pillars, how we elevate the role of women and girls as a core pillar of foreign policy, but also the management side. How do we have metrics and analytics in today's management? We actually looked at things that may relate to some of you, which is that the living situation in Northern Virginia has become a national security threat. The fact that we have trouble recruiting personnel here because they can't afford to live here and they can't afford the commute time into work. And so we may not think of those as national security issues, but we were looking at how we address some of those problems in that context. Then doing the peace negotiations in Congo, which we can talk about, but probably aren't core to some of the conversations today. Here's what I just want to say before we open up about this race for governor. I think that the election of Donald Trump was a disaster. I'm not making news there. But I think that it's important in my mind to understand the election of Donald Trump, or Donald Trump's presence today, as not the creation of the problem, but the result of problems. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years is a collision course of 2 trajectories. One is the increasing disappearance of work in the middle class that is only getting worse as automation comes to scale. And the second has been the resurgence of efforts to divide us based on race and region. The economic anxiety, the debate about whether this was about economics or about race, is one of the sillier debates inside the Beltway. Because in American history, these 2 things have always gone hand in hand. When economic anxiety rises, weak leaders like Trump will come in and try to blame those problems on any other, whether that's an internal minority or an external force, as an excuse to fight and not to solve the problem. But the economic challenge is real. The middle class in Virginia over the last 20 years has basically seen no raise at all. The median income has not changed in Virginia for 15 years. Our minimum wage today is below West Virginia's. People working in Northern Virginia full-time are making $14,000 a year. That's what the minimum wage is. And if you think, oh, well, that's someone just out of college, they're 22 years old, it's not a problem. The typical minimum wage worker in Virginia is a 36-year-old woman with 2 kids trying to survive on $14,000 a year. Now, what most of them, of course, do is take that job, take a nap for an hour, and start a second full-time job, in which case they're spending 85 hours a week and still making $30,000 a year. Most of the women that I talk to who work at National Airport are in that area. So we have people who've seen this challenge. 35 to 50% of jobs in Virginia could be affected by automation in the next 15 years. People can feel that. They bring it up to me in a lot of these red counties. So I go on all of that because I think in that environment we have a choice to do one of two things. In an environment of change, an environment of fear, we either turn against each other or we come together. We either try to blame our neighbors or we decide the only way we're going to survive this is to realize that we're in this together. And I think right now the reason that the resistance to Donald Trump has been so strong and so broad, and why the intensity of support for him is dropping, is because I think a message of compassion and of common humanity is stronger than a message of division. And I've spent a lot of this campaign already in very red counties. I've spent a lot of time with Trump supporters, but also people who voted for third-party candidates. Because we remember in Virginia that 7% of Virginians voted for neither President Trump nor Secretary Clinton. There are a lot of people out there that don't know what to believe right now. And I believe on issues of Medicaid expansion, on issues of starting to treat addiction as a health problem and not as a crime, on issues of criminal justice reform, and on issues related to people with disabilities, there's an enormous groundswell of interest in figuring out policies that help people up, not push people down. And part of what I'm trying to do in this race is not just win, but win with a mandate to actually go to Richmond and govern. And the way we do that is to not just win the votes in the Crescent, but to actually go out and win votes in some of these areas where the legislators, I believe, have been not representing their own constituents. Because when I go to coal country, I've been out 5 times to that area, and they know I'm a climate hawk. They know I hate coal. They know that I believe in trying to bring in new clean energy jobs and localized food jobs into those areas. But part of what they can do is literally look across the border into Kentucky and see relatives who have the Medicaid expansion and are asking the question, why not us? For all of our hypotheticals in politics, that was 400,000 Virginians who could have had care just a couple of weeks ago. It's $10 billion that left the state. Sure, it's 400,000 people. And that would have included mental health coverage, disability coverage, in many cases, and addiction services that are desperately needed. The ultimate irony of that is they weren't the only ones who lost. All of those expenses, of course, were passed on to all of us who have private insurance. And our premiums go up from that deadweight loss, which means literally we now have a Republican Party in Virginia who would rather tax the middle class just to make sure the working poor and people with disabilities don't get coverage.